On the next Podium, what does an art form born centuries ago have to say to us today?
Chinese Muslims had adopted the Islamic culture, but they were also remained totally Chinese in their outlook and their artistic concept.
Find out when American master of Arabic calligraphy Muhammad Zakaria explains the Hilya of Muhammad as in the context of Ottoman calligraphy. An exclusive lecture coming up on Podium.
People in their right.
When we talk about calligraphy, why, you know, there's our own Latin-based calligraphy. Unfortunately, I'm not even terrible in that. I'm illegible, and I don't do it. So my field really is Arabic script calligraphy, and to share the guilt a little bit, we have a number of people practicing it now here in the States, and I'm one of those. My only distinction in it really is that I got in here a lot earlier than they did. I started in 1961. I'm going to start, first of all, with the basic stuff. You write Arabic and Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, Persian, all these languages. You write from the right to the left. It's a sweeping motion that goes in this direction, and the goal in that is to make it as smooth and legible as possible. Smoothness and legibility in the first century of Islamic history were not the goal. Merely to get things on the parchment was the goal. And after that, people moved into beautifying the product. But it came step by step, and it evolved person by person. Largely, the first evolutions were in the Hijaz of what is now Saudi Arabia. The secondary ones were in the really the Syrian Palestinian area, and then after that, the great center of teaching and dissemination was Baghdad, and it stayed that way for quite a while until the Mongol sack of Baghdad, which ruined the whole deal. And then at that point, there was a teacher who named Yakut, whose students, of course, they fled from all this, and they went to Anatolia and Iran and various places in that central, slightly northern region. And from there, it disseminated, and eventually it formed three centers. The Constantinople Center, the Iranian Center, and the Indian Center. And from these, various styles and theories emerged actually like a dandelion with lots of little seeds clustered around the center. Aside from that, there were peripheral areas where some of the most beautiful work came from. I'm thinking here basically of Morocco and Spain and the North African edge, where quite distinct and different kind of things happened. The influences were completely different, the origins were completely different, and the results are also quite different. I didn't cover it in the slides today. It would take another carousel to do that. There's a revival of that going on today too, so these arts are all quite firmly established now. On the other end of the spectrum, there was a huge tradition and technique of doing this in a very classic way in central China and in Peking and places like that, whereby Chinese Muslims had adopted the Islamic culture, but they were also remained totally Chinese in their outlook and in their artistic concepts. But they began to use the Arabic alphabet and the phrases from the Quran and things like that in a very Chinese way, using Chinese paper, the soft rice paper, the brushes, the thin inks, developing just absolutely wonderful concepts of these things. And this is, of course, still going on today also. But it's a branch that's far out in the east, and we're becoming quite familiar with it now through the efforts of the young Haji Nuruddin. And so everybody seems to know about him. He's a very funny man, actually. He's a very good guy, great calligrapher. So, the second thing I'm going to be talking about tonight is how a certain text takes its place in the firmament of texts used for calligraphy, and that is a text called hilye. And hilye is a word originally called hilya. It was an Arabic word. It meant two things. It meant sort of an embellishment or a decoration, but it had a primary meaning of description, and so often people who don't know the origins of this word think that the hilya is actually an ornament, but it's not. It's a description. It's a very common word for description in the old days. Now it's not known at all. So this hilya is a form unique to Arabic, as far as I can tell, whereby a person is described in very, very succinct language, very pungent, what we call it, eloquent language. His nature is described, his physiognomy, his looks, his way of walking, and then things like his moral character, what he did, what he said, how he spoke, how he related to people. On the shorter hilyas, this is very concise, but some of them we have are quite long and detailed. And so when we think that we have this thing called the Quran, people sometimes fail to imagine, how did it get there? Did it come on the doorstep like a newspaper, or how did it come and how was it developed? And so we have to come to Muhammad, and he was the prophet of Islam, as we all know, and he was the one that it came to over a period of over 20 years. And piece by piece, bit by bit, and it was written down and so forth like that. And so we begin to wonder, well, who was this Muhammad? You know, what was he like? What kind of a person was he? Well, the hilyas, they really answer this question, and they answer it in a way that I would call portable. These things my memory, by the way, is not very good, but for a person whose memory is halfway decent, these things are very, very memorizable and can be carried around in your mind. And so they were things that would help people to understand who this person was and what were his expectations of people and what were his expectations for himself and how people felt about him. And so I've written a rather long paper on the topic, and I'm going to, I don't like reading these things in public, you know, but I'm going to break my habit a little bit and read a few things off of this. But first, let's turn to the slides a little bit, and let me show you some slides. It's common Muslim practice to begin talking or a speech with a phrase called the Bismillah, which is in the name of God, the universally merciful and the specifically merciful, two forms of mercy. People who study these things can tell you the meanings of this thing is very intense. Hilyas sometimes are for people other than Muhammad. There's a text which has a number of them dealing with prophets like Solomon. And this is one of Solomon. This is Solomon was of pale complexion. His body was large, very clean and beautiful. He was humble and unpretentious and liked to associate with the poor and would keep company with them. He would say, "The poor must sit with the poor." During his father Dawood's reign, David, his father would consult him because of his advanced intellect and knowledge, which was remarkable considering his young age. But we will stick here to the Hilyas that are more well known. The one that we see the most in the text here is the one that said it's transmitted from Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, may God be pleased with him, who, when asked to describe the Prophet, peace be upon him, would say, "He was not too tall, nor was he too short. He was medium-sized. His hair was not short and curly, but nor was it lank, but in between." You see, the beginning. He's describing by what it isn't more than what it is. His face was not narrow, nor was it fully round, but there was a roundness to it. His skin was white, leaning towards pink. His eyes were black. He had long eyelashes. He was big-boned and had wide shoulders. He had no body hair at all, except in the middle of his chest. He had thick hands and feet, and when he walked inclined as if descending from a slope. And when he looked at somebody, he looked at them full in the face. He didn't look out of the corner of his eyes. Between his shoulder blades was the seal of prophecy, which was a mole, actually, the sign that he was the last of the prophets. He was the most generous-hearted of men, the most truthful of them in speech, the most mild-tempered of them, and the noblest of them in lineage. Also, best of them towards his family is important there. Whoever saw him unexpectedly was in awe of him, and whoever associated with him familiarly loved him. Anyone who would describe him would say, "I never saw before him or after him the like of him." May peace be upon him. Now, the top part of that double Hilya I showed had a very interesting, very short one. Hilal related to us from Atta bin Yasar. He said, "I met Abdullah ibn Amr bin As, and I said, 'Tell me about the description or the wasf or Hilya of the Prophet of God, peace be upon him.' And he said, 'Yes, certainly. By God, he was described in the Torah in some ways that he is described in the Quran. Namely, O Prophet, we have sent you as a witness, a bringer of good tidings, and a warner.'" And then the Hilya adds, "And as a protector of the weak. You are my servant and my prophet. I have named you the one who relies." And then he continues, "He was not crude, nor was he coarse, nor was he one to shout and make a lot of noise in the marketplace. He did not answer an evil deed with another, but he would pardon and forgive. He would not be taken by God until he had straightened out the crooked people, until they would confess that there was no divinity but God. And he would open eyes that were blind and ears that were deaf and closed hearts. Oh God, grant mercy and peace to our Master Muhammad and his family." They describe a living person who had this prophetic visitation, and he functioned in that ways. And you get a picture of a person, and we kind of guessed that most of the prophets were kind of like this. That, you know, we have this idea when you hear about a prophet of Cecil B. DeMille, you know, and Charlton Heston, and they're ragged and ranting and kind of off the edge kind of people, you know. And yet we have a picture here of a reasonable human being who faced difficulties and overcame them without getting mad and without being a person who lost it, you know. So I think these things are pretty important to understand as to how this person was. Basically, the script reform came in 1928, and it was, of course, a shock to the people who made their living using calligraphic and writing. It's said that there was a street that had many of their shops on it, and they all came to work one morning, and it was all locked up. There were people who put padlocks on their doors, and they were finito. You know, they had to clear out. So basically, a lot of them went into other occupations, printing, raising grapes. One of the famous guys did grapes and things like that. People kept it going, but in a private matter. A lot of the great works were thrown out in the street and destroyed, and we don't have them. But a lot of them are also saved and still keep turning up. So it's I think a lot of things are put in the attic. Like a guy found about 15 years ago, he was rummaging around in his grandfather's attic, and he found a whole barrel full of pens that must have been 200 years old. And so he distributed them to all of us. We all got a handful of these things, and they're wonderful pens. There was a great author who was transcribing a famous book called Tuhfe Hattatin, a very famous book. And he was writing it in an Arabic script, Turkish, and the Ottoman. And it was 1928, the law was passed. He said, well, we've got to finish this book. So he actually went to Ataturk, and he was a powerful literary figure. And he said, please let us just finish this one book. And Ataturk said, yeah, okay, finish this book. And it will be the last ever printed in Turkey in that script. And they did. And it's still available today through people who reproduce it with Xeroxes. So the book, in a sense, passed that stage, and it's still there. You know, you might think people like this are diehards, but you know, it has something of value to it that doesn't want to get lost. Starting in the late 50s, really, there was a comeback. People weren't so afraid of it. You know, all the reforms had been done. People were beginning to get more used to things. And nowadays, really starting in about 1970, 1965, something like that, largely through the efforts of Hamid Aytaç and some of the tycoon collectors and things like that, and Necmet Dean and people like that, they began to realize they had something very valuable on their hands, and they needed to promote it and save it. And so that whole process began to accelerate, and many people began to take lessons. And then people from other countries began to come. And so it got universal. You know, we even have guys in Japan coming over. Yes, sir?
In the letters, like, إن الله لا يخلف الميعاد. The letter fa is the biggest letter among the whole sentence. Is there any wisdom?
Yeah, that is because in that script, you like to put something in the middle that opens out, because the script, that kind of a saying is like something you want to take a big breath. You just look at it. You don't want it all cramped up. You know, you don't want it stacked up and cramped out. You want to have a large part of it that blends out, but it's very regular. That stretched out line is 10 dots long. If you make it 9, you can get away with it. But if you go to 8, people will say, no, that's too short, doesn't give it enough room. So that script is very carefully regulated. They say it's the only script that there are plenty of things you actually can't write in it because they don't look right.
The importance of moving from representation of ideas to stylistic representation and the motion in the lettering that he communicated, in the different sizes and all of the different artists that make up the tradition of Islamic calligraphy, I found fascinating. What's quite interesting is the absence of the kind of traditional use of visual art, as in Christianity, has sort of highlighted the emphasis on calligraphy in Islam, and I've always appreciated that.
Some of the major points he made that I found interesting, well, one was the various kinds of calligraphy that there are, the evolution of it, how it was in the beginning, it was kind of crude, and then it grew more fancy, got more embellished, and that there are actual, like, almost like artisans, as it were, of calligraphy, and that they like dedicate their lives to like writing these very beautiful pieces of artwork that also provide meaning and significance to the Muslim people. And I just thought it was just a different view, a different outlook on the culture, and I thought it was just very intriguing.